Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12. Again, I have to remind you that you may have to suffer through some Dayquil moments with me. But we are going to stay in this text together. We've been in Romans for a long time, and we got chapter 12. It was a turning point in Romans. The very first word there was therefore. We talked about that last week. And if Paul hadn't said what he said in chapters 1 through 11, he wouldn't be talking like he is in chapter 12. What I need to remind you of, though, in this text, interestingly enough, is Paul has never been to Rome, remember? Paul has never been to Rome. So he's writing to a church he's never been to, talking about a gospel that they've heard, maybe some things they've heard that he said that he didn't say, and he straightened those things out. What I find fascinating about the text we're in today is the fact that this fits any church. And this really does. And Paul wasn't shooting in the dark here. He knew that this would fit. Last week he told them to live your life, to offer your body as a living sacrifice. That's what your spiritual worship is. And we talked a lot about that. And we talked about understanding God's will and being renewed, being able to think differently. Right? And he says that in verse 2. He says, do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, good, pleasing, and perfect will. And then he jumps right into something very important in verse 3. He says, for by the grace given to me, I say to every one of you, except for you, or maybe the person sitting next to you. No, he says, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought. Well, if you look at the context in Romans, it could be talking about the Jewish people thinking more highly of themselves than they ought to, or the Gentile peoples thinking more highly of themselves than they ought to. Remember the broken branches and the grafting thing? Maybe that's what he's talking about. Or maybe just Paul knows. He knows when you get a group of people together, there are some people who think of themselves more highly than they ought to. He says instead, he says, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment. What a great choice of words. Sober judgment. Right? Now, some of us know what it's like, maybe once or twice in your life, to be on the other side of the sober line. No? Maybe. Well, maybe you have to take some. I've told my experience, okay? When you're on the other side of that sober line, your judgment isn't too good. Like, distances are different. Right? Doors seem bigger. Spaces seem bigger. You run into things because they're not where they thought they were, right? Okay, so that's the not sober judgment. Sober judgment is not influenced by anything that gets you heady. You know the word heady? You know, things that give you the light head? When you first fall in love, it's a very heady feeling. Some people have a headiness about the way they look at themselves. They don't have a sober judgment. They think more highly of themselves than they ought. Have I lost anybody here yet? Okay. Okay. Paul knows that this is true. And he knows how that affects churches. That's detrimental to churches. He says, by the grace given to me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgments in accordance with the measure of faith God is giving you. What's the important thing to Paul? Faith. Is it gifts? No, it's faith. It's trust. It's a trust-based relationship, okay? That's where it starts. And this is very important because he's going to talk about, he says, verse 4. Just as each of us has one body with many members, and these members do not all have the same function, so in Christ we who are many form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. This is one of Paul's favorite analogies. I don't know if it originated with him. I don't know. But he uses it a lot in his writings. The body. Right? You have a body. That's part of the body, but there's separate parts. Right? He uses the idea of, the hearing and the smell. No, hearing and seeing. Where would they talk about that in Corinthians? He said if the whole body were the eye, where would the sense of hearing be? And if the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of smell be? Okay? Not everybody has the same role. Everybody is part, but they're all part of the same thing. Now, when somebody doesn't look at themselves in sober judgment, they think they are the whole. They think they're the classic stem cell. They can just kind of move in there and become part of everything. Think about this. The most talented part of your body is your hand. Right? Sometimes your neck gets tired of holding up your head. Who's it ask for help? Right? The hand is not the neck, but it helps sometimes. Sometimes when one of your feet or both your feet aren't doing too well, who do you help to ask it along? Right? You got your walker, your cane, you get your hand in there, and But if your hand starts to think, oh yeah, I'm a foot too, or I'm a neck, or I can do it all, where would that hand be without the elbow? Out there somewhere, right? Doing all kinds of things, but can't get where it needs to go. All right. Fascinating analogy. It's a fascinating analogy. It really is. As you are all members of the body, and you don't think that you're the whole body. That's what he's saying. Just don't get that in your head. You need each other. You are needed. You're a part of the whole. You got that? When you think you are the whole, you have left sober judgment. Amen. And you are going to do damage to the body. Now how does that flesh out? He says, all right, let's look at some examples. He says, we have different gifts according to the grace given to us. If a man's gift is prophesying, let him use it in proportion with his faith. If it is serving, let him serve. If it's teaching, let him teach. If it's encouraging, let him encourage. If it is contributing to the needs of others, let him give generously. If it is leadership, let him govern diligently. If it is showing mercy, let him do it cheerfully. What an interesting list he picks out of gifts, right? The first one is prophecy. Remember what the word prophet means? It means mouth, right? Those who speak the words of God. Now, at this time in the church, they didn't have a written text. They couldn't get upstairs, so I'll turn over to Romans chapter 12. That's like a deja vu. No, I'm not starting over. Okay? They didn't have that. As a matter of fact, not many of them had copies of the Old Testament scriptures either. So people would have divine utterances. They would speak the words of God. Now that's in a category we call a spiritual gift, right? That's the only one he lists like that. Look at the rest of them. Teaching, preaching, leadership, giving, serving. That's an interesting list. I mean, he didn't say, okay, those are prophets. Another list, he said there's those who work miracles, those who speak in tongues. He didn't list that. He hasn't been to Rome, guys. He doesn't know who has spiritual gifts like that or not. Matter of fact, they tend to follow Paul around. When he places hands on people, he can impart some of those things. It's one of the special things about Paul's ministry. But here's his examples. There are those who speak the words of God. There are those who teach. There are those who serve. There are those who encourage. I thought we're all supposed to encourage.